More about the debates. We're joined now in New York by George Farah. He's the founder and executive director of Open Debates, the author of No Debate: How the Republican and Democratic Parties Secretly Control the Presidential Debates. George, welcome to Democracy Now! Though it's interesting, you're there in our studios in New York, and we're here, well, just outside Denver, where the debates are taking place tonight, so we can bring folks, well, an expanded version of the debates. George, how did it come to be that the Commission of Presidential Debates came into being? What is this commission?
Well, the Commission on Presidential Debates sounds like a government agency. It sounds like a nonpartisan entity, which is by design. It's intended to deceive the American people. But in reality, it's a private corporation financed primarily by Anheuser-Busch and other major companies that was created by the Republican and Democratic parties to seize control of the presidential debates from the League of Women Voters in 1987. And precisely as you said, Amy, every 4 years, this commission allows the major party campaigns to meet behind closed doors and draft a secret contract, a memorandum of understanding that dictates many of the terms. The reason for the commission's creation is that the previous sponsor, the League of Women Voters, was a genuine nonpartisan entity, our voice, the voice of the American people in the negotiation room. And time again, the League had the courage to stand up to the Republican and Democratic campaigns to insist on challenging and creative formats, to insist on the inclusion of independent candidates that the vast majority of the American people wanted to see, and most importantly, to insist on transparency so that any attempts by the Republican Democratic parties to manipulate the presidential debates would result in an enormous political price. And it's precisely because the
George,
League...
you have a lot of time here, so I really want you to lay out how this happened. Explain the moment when this was taken out of the hands of the League of Women Voters and this commission was formed. How was this justified?
The best part of the history starts in 1980. In 1980, John B. Anderson, an independent candidate for president, runs against President Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan. President Jimmy Carter absolutely opposed independent candidate John Anderson's participation in the presidential debates, and the League had a choice. Do they support the independent candidate's participation and defy the wishes of the President of the United States, or do they capitulate to the demands of President Jimmy Carter? The League did the right thing. It stood up to the President of the United States, invited John B. Anderson. The President refused to show up. The League went forward anyway and had a presidential debate that was watched by 55 million Americans. You fast forward 4 years later, Amy, and the Walter Mondale and Ronald Reagan campaigns vetoed 80 of the moderators that the League of Women Voters had proposed for the debates. They were simply trying to get rid of...
80?
80. They were trying to get rid of difficult questions.
80?
80. And the League didn't just, say, okay, that's fine, we'll allow you to select a moderator that's going to ask softball questions. The League held a press conference and lambasted the campaigns for trying to get rid of difficult questions. And of course, there was a public outcry. So the League marshaled public support to criticize the campaigns when they attempted to defy our democratic process, and as the result was fantastic. For the next debate, the campaigns were required to accept the League's proposed moderators for fear of an additional public outcry. And you fast forward 4 more years later, and you have the Michael Dukakis and George Bush campaigns, the Republican and Democratic nominees, drafting the first ever 12-page secret debate contract. They gave it to the League of Women Voters and said, please implement this. And the League said, are you kidding me? We're not going to implement a secret contract that dictates the terms of the format. Instead, they released the contract to the public, and they held a press conference accusing the candidates of, quote, perpetrating a fraud on the American people, end quote, and refusing to be, this is another quote, an accessory to the hoodwinking of the American people. Well, Amy, conveniently, just a year earlier, the Republican and Democratic parties had ratified an agreement to, quote, take over the presidential debates. And they created this artifice, this commission. And the commission was waiting in the wings and stepped right in and implemented the very same 12-page contract that the League had so effectively denounced. And ever since, we have
tell us what, since the League did release it, the League of Women Voters at the time, what was in this 12-page contract, at least then?
And the 12-page contract then said very specific provisions that the candidates cannot actually ask each other any questions during the debates, that no third-party candidates will be permitted to participate in those events, that there will be a certain number of audience members will be supporters of the various candidates. Actually, it's quite tame compared to the contracts that we've seen in recent years. That contract was 12 pages. The 2004 contract that we've managed to obtain a copy of was 32 pages. So over time, the candidates have made even greater efforts to control various components of the debates to eliminate both third-party candidates, unpredictable questions, and any threat to their dominance in our political process. So
this commission, talk about the heads of the commission and who they are, who they were when it started, Frank Fahrenkopf and Paul Kirk, and who they are today, and who they represent.
Frank Fahrenkopf and Paul Kirk were the original co-chairs of the Commission on Presidential Debates. Frank Fahrenkopf is the former chair of the Republican Party, and Paul Kirk is the former chair of the Democratic Party. And when they created the commission, for 15 months, they simultaneously served as co-chairs of their respective parties and the commission. So it was, of course, by definition, an entity that was absolutely loyal to the two parties. Well, guess what? Frank Fahrenkopf still is co-chair of the Commission on Presidential Debates decades later, and he has one other job, his day job. He's the director of the American Gaming Association. In other words, he's the nation's leading gambling lobbyist. When I asked Frank, hey, do you feel comfortable having beer and tobacco companies paying for our most important election events, our presidential debates? He said, boy, you're talking to the wrong guy. I represent the gambling industry. The other co-chair of the Commission on Presidential Debates now is Mike McCurry, former press secretary to Bill Clinton, and also a lobbyist. He's lobbied aggressively on behalf of the telecommunications industry. So you have two people in charge of these presidential debates that, number one, are loyal to their parties, their political operatives, and number two, have demonstrated time and time again a willingness to sacrifice the interest of the American people for private, political, and financial interests. These are not exactly people who hesitate to subjugate the willingness and the democratic process to the private interests that benefit from these actual debates.
So can you talk about what happened this past week, George Farah? The advertising agency BBH, the YWCA, Philips North America, terminating their sponsorship of the debates. First of all, what are corporations doing sponsoring these presidential debates, and why have these organizations pulled out?
Well, the Commission on Presidential Debates gets the vast majority of its money from major businesses that support it. Anheuser-Busch is by far and away the biggest contributor to the Commission. So, by and large, our presidential debates are brought to you by Bud Light. And if you actually go to some of these debate sites, I don't know how it is this year, but in the past, there have been Anheuser-Busch tents where scantily clad women are passing out pamphlets denouncing beer taxes. The CEOs of these companies get access to the debates. They sit in the audience. They're invited to receptions to meet with campaign staff. They get a wonderful benefit because they're able to simultaneously demonstrate their support for both major parties, hit two birds with one stone, and get a tax deduction to boot. Back when the League of Women Voters used to sponsor these events, they struggled, Amy, to raise $5,000 contributions from companies. It was very difficult. But because they're now perceived as a sort of soft money donation, this is yet another avenue for businesses with regulatory interest before Congress to influence our political process. Well, we've launched a campaign since the inception of my organization in 2004, pushing our supporters, which number in the tens of thousands, to write letters and emails to the various sponsors demanding that they withdraw their support of the Commission. This year, with the support of other organizations, one called Help the Commission, an infusion of enthusiasm from third parties, including the Libertarian Party and the Green Party, for the first time ever, we actually have succeeded in achieving some tangible goals. Not just one sponsor, but 3 of the 10 sponsors have withdrawn support. BBH, a British advertising agency, YWCA, a nonprofit, and, most importantly, Philips Electronics, a tech giant. Due to the extraordinary public pressure that we've exerted on them, they have said we will no longer be affiliated with an entity that is perceived correctly as being partisan and fundamentally anti-democratic. This is a triumph for the debate reform movement, and I hope the beginning of unveiling the Commission for what it truly is and displacing it.
George Farah, say again the companies that continue to support the presidential commission, the Commission on Presidential Debates.
There are 7 remaining sponsors. There are 3 companies. Anheuser-Busch, again, the poster child for contributing to the commission. You have Southwest Airlines. You have the International Bottled Water Association. Then you have 2 foundations, the Howard Buffett Foundation. Howard Buffett happens to be a board member of the commission. Something called the Marjorie Kovler Fund that's affiliated with the Kennedy Library. And then you have 2 law firms, Corming, which is a specific law firm that focuses on issues in Washington, and Sheldon Cohen, a national security lawyer. These are the 7 entities that are backing our Commission on Presidential Debates. This is not the way these ought to be run. These should be supported by civic groups, nonpartisan organizations with a real focus on the democratic process. Instead, they're subcontracting out a presidential debate process to Anheuser-Busch.
It'll be interesting to see if there's bottled water on their podiums, or if there's Bud Light. I mean, who knows? But I wanted to go to one of the third-party candidates shut out of tonight's debate, Libertarian candidate Gary Johnson, the former governor of New Mexico. He appeared recently on Neil Cavuto's show on Fox Business.
Governor, half the battle is getting on those ballots and polling well to get in those debates. So it's sort of like a tough road.
Very catch-22. I mean, right now I'm 5% nationally. Fact is, I'm not being recognized, though, at 5% nationally. And if people recognize that I was at 5% nationally, Neil, the overwhelming reaction would be, well, who the hell is Gary Johnson?
Yeah, what does it take to get into the debates?
Well, you got to get in the polls first to determine who's in the debates.
And earlier this summer, the Green Party wrapped up its convention with the nomination of its presidential candidate, the physician, Dr. Jill Stein, and her running mate, the anti-poverty activist, Sherry Hunkela. Stein called her ticket a viable third-party challenge to corporate beholden Republicans and Democrats.
I strongly agree that grassroots democracy grows from the local community up. But at the same time, we have a state of emergency, I think, at the national level. And to silence the only hope of an opposition voice in this election when so much is at stake, I think would be just a terrible loss for the American people. There's no reason why Americans should have to walk into the voting booth in November and have only effectively 2 Wall Street-sponsored choices.
That